February 18th, 1943. A nondescript office building in the Zossen military complex, 30 kilometers south of Berlin. Major Klaus Bergmann sat at his desk in the Foreign Armies West intelligence section, staring at a single sheet of paper that had arrived via diplomatic pouch from the German consulate in Bern, Switzerland. The document was a photostat of an American trade journal article, mundane in appearance, published by Automotive Industries magazine in December 1942. It contained production statistics from American tank manufacturing facilities, released publicly as part of a war bonds promotion campaign. The numbers were absurd. They had to be propaganda. Bergmann had spent the previous 18 months meticulously tracking American armored vehicle production through every available intelligence source. Agent networks in neutral countries, signals intelligence from radio intercepts, aerial reconnaissance photographs of American factories, interrogation reports from the handful of American prisoners captured in North Africa, technical assessments from captured equipment. His files contained detailed calculations of American industrial capacity, production rates, and projected output based on known factory locations and estimated manufacturing capabilities. According to his most optimistic projections, American industry could produce perhaps 120 medium tanks per month by mid-1943. This figure assumed maximum efficiency, full factory utilization, streamlined production methods, and no significant disruptions from labor disputes or material shortages. It was an aggressive estimate that his colleagues had questioned as too generous to American capabilities. Some analysts argued the real number would be closer to 80 tanks monthly, given American industrial inexperience with military production and the inherent inefficiencies of converting civilian automotive plants to military manufacturing. The article on his desk claimed American factories had produced 2008 medium tanks in November 1942 alone, in a single month. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Bergmann reached for his telephone and requested an immediate meeting with Colonel Alexis von Roen, Chief of Foreign Armies West. This could not wait for the regular morning intelligence briefing. If these numbers were even remotely accurate, every German assumption about the timeline and scale of American military mobilization was catastrophically wrong. The strategic implications would cascade through every theater of the war. The path to this moment of terrible revelation had begun more than a year earlier, in the winter of 1941, when German intelligence first attempted to assess American tank production capacity. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. American industrial capability was well documented through pre-war trade publications, commercial exchanges, and diplomatic reporting. German military attaches had visited American automobile factories during the 1930s and filed detailed reports on production methods, organizational structures, and manufacturing capacity. The Wehrmacht's Technical Intelligence Division had compiled comprehensive files on American automotive industry, including facility locations, annual production volumes, workforce sizes, and technical capabilities. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler. These companies were global industrial powerhouses whose civilian production statistics were matters of public record. Converting that baseline data into military production estimates should have been a relatively simple analytical exercise. The analysts began with fundamentals. Tank production required specialized facilities, trained workers, precision machinery, and complex supply chains for components and raw materials. Germany's own experience converting civilian industry to military production provided the reference framework. When Germany began serious rearmament in the mid-1930s, expanding tank production from minimal peacetime levels to wartime requirements had taken years of sustained effort. New factories had to be constructed, existing facilities had to be extensively modified, Workers had to be trained in specialized skills. Supply chains had to be established for armor, plate, engines, transmissions, weapon systems, and thousands of other components. By 1941, after 8 years of focused rearmament and 2 years of wartime mobilization, German industry was producing approximately 250 medium and heavy tanks per month. This represented maximum sustainable output from the entire German industrial base, including captured factories in occupied Czechoslovakia and France. Every production increase required months of preparation, factory expansion, workforce training, and supply chain development. Quality standards had to be maintained, defects minimized, components precisely manufactured to tight tolerances. German analysts applied this experience-based understanding to American industrial capacity. America's automotive industry was larger than Germany's, certainly. American factories produced millions of civilian vehicles annually compared to Germany's smaller automotive sector. But military production was categorically different from civilian manufacturing. Tanks were not automobiles with armor welded on. They required specialized design, precision manufacturing, careful quality control, and extensive testing. The analysts identified American facilities capable of tank production through pre-war knowledge and ongoing intelligence collection. The Detroit Arsenal, a massive facility in Warren, Michigan, constructed specifically for military production. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal, the Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, which had experience with heavy machinery, the Pacific Car and Foundry Company, the American Locomotive Company. Each facility was assessed for maximum theoretical capacity based on physical size, estimated workforce, known machinery installation, and typical production cycle times for complex armored vehicles. The calculations seemed rigorous and comprehensive. The Detroit Arsenal, the largest and most modern American tank facility, occupied approximately 113 acres under roof. German technical experts estimated such a facility could produce perhaps 40 to 50 medium tanks monthly at peak efficiency. This assumed 3-shift operations, streamlined assembly processes, adequate component supply, and minimal production disruptions. Other smaller facilities might contribute another 30 to 40 tanks monthly combined, depending on their size and specialization. Total estimated American medium tank production capacity, assuming full mobilization and optimal conditions, approximately 90 to 120 tanks per month by late 1943. This estimate was documented in a formal intelligence assessment distributed to Wehrmacht planning staffs in March 1942. The report carried classification markings restricting distribution to senior officers with operational planning responsibilities. It became the baseline for German strategic calculations about American armored strength in the European theater. The estimate seemed entirely reasonable based on available information and German industrial experience. 120 tanks per month translated to roughly 1,400 tanks annually. Over 2 years, American industry might produce 3,000 medium tanks total, accounting for production increases as facilities expanded and workers gained experience. This was a substantial force, certainly enough to equip multiple armored divisions, but it was manageable within the context of German military planning. The Wehrmacht had destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. German tactical superiority, superior armor design, better crew training, and effective anti-tank weapons had proven capable of defeating numerically superior enemy armor. If American tanks were comparable to Soviet models in quality, and all intelligence suggested American designs were actually inferior to Soviet 34 tanks in armor protection and firepower, then German forces could handle American armored formations even if they eventually achieved numerical parity. The comfortable certainty began developing cracks in early 1942, though the implications were not immediately apparent. In May 1942, a German military attaché in Stockholm forwarded a report based on Swedish intelligence sources with contacts in American industrial circles. The report claimed American tank production in the first quarter of 1942 had exceeded 1,000 units. The attaché noted this seemed inconsistent with previous German estimates, but forwarded the information for analysis. The report was reviewed by Major Bergmann and his colleagues in Foreign Armies West. They noted the discrepancy, but identified multiple reasons to question the Swedish intelligence. First, the source was second-hand, based on Swedish commercial contacts rather than direct observation. Second, the numbers might include all armoured vehicles, not just medium tanks comparable to German Panzer models. American production statistics often conflated light tanks, tank destroyers, armoured cars, and other tracked vehicles into general categories that inflated apparent tank production. Third, early production runs were always less efficient than sustained manufacturing. If Americans were indeed producing 1,000 tanks in 3 months, their production rate would inevitably decline as initial stockpiles of components were exhausted and the complexities of sustained manufacturing became apparent. The analysts filed the report with a notation that it likely represented inflated figures or definitional differences rather than actual medium tank output. The baseline estimate of 90 to 120 tanks monthly remained unchanged. This was a critical moment where intelligence could have been updated based on new information, but organizational inertia and confirmation bias preserved existing estimates that aligned with German assumptions about industrial mobilization timelines. The second warning came in November 1942, following the Allied invasion of North Africa. German forces in Tunisia captured American equipment in significant quantities during early engagements. M3 medium tanks. M4 medium tanks, designated Sherman by the British. Half-tracks, armoured cars, trucks. The equipment was systematically catalogued, photographed, and assessed by technical intelligence teams. The Sherman tank in particular received extensive analysis. German technical officers examined armour thickness, measured at approximately 2 inches on the frontal hull and turret. They tested the 75mm main gun against German armour samples. They evaluated the engine, a gasoline-powered radial aircraft engine producing approximately 400 horsepower. They assessed the suspension, transmission, and overall design philosophy. The technical verdict was mixed but generally unimpressed. The Sherman's armour was adequate but not exceptional, vulnerable to German 75mm and 88mm anti-tank guns at normal combat ranges. The gasoline engine was a significant vulnerability, far more prone to catastrophic fires than German diesel engines when hit. The mechanical reliability was good. The ergonomics were excellent with spacious crew compartment and good visibility, but the overall combat capability was assessed as inferior to German medium tanks like the Panzer Mark IV. German tank crews who engaged Shermans in combat confirmed these assessments. Shermans could be penetrated frontally at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters by German tank guns. The tall profile made them easier to spot and target than lower-profile German designs. The tendency to burn when penetrated, called brewing up by British crews or Ronsons after the cigarette lighter, became well known among German gunners. In tactical engagements, German tank commanders reported favourable kill ratios, often destroying multiple Shermans for each German tank lost. This tactical superiority reinforced German confidence in qualitative advantages, compensating for potential numerical inferiority. If German tanks were superior in design and German crews were superior in training, then American armour posed manageable threats even in larger numbers. The uncomfortable implication in the captured equipment analysis was not the Sherman's combat capability, which met German expectations for American engineering, but the serial numbers stamped on various components. Every military vehicle carries identification numbers on major assemblies: engine blocks, transmission cases, hull plates, turret rings. These components are marked during manufacturing for quality control and logistics tracking. German technical intelligence officers documented these markings as standard procedure when examining captured equipment. The serial numbers from Shermans captured in Tunisia were compiled into summary reports, noting vehicle identification codes and component manufacturing data. A junior analyst in the Technical Intelligence Division noticed something odd about the serial number sequences. The Shermans captured in Tunisia during November and December 1942 carried serial numbers, suggesting they were manufactured in batches spanning several months from mid-year through autumn. But the numbering sequences implied far more vehicles than German estimates predicted for total American tank production. If the captured tanks numbered in the 4,000s represented production from just 5 or 6 months, and these were only vehicles shipped to North Africa rather than the entire American output, then actual production rates had to be substantially higher than 90 to 120 tanks monthly. The analyst prepared a brief memorandum questioning whether American tank production might be occurring at larger scale than currently estimated. The memorandum was reviewed, annotated with skeptical comments about the reliability of extrapolating from limited serial number samples, and filed without substantive follow-up action. This represented a second missed opportunity to revise estimates based on physical evidence. The serial numbers were hard data, not subject to misinterpretation or propaganda inflation. But the implications contradicted established assessments, and organizational psychology favored maintaining existing estimates rather than undertaking comprehensive revision based on ambiguous evidence. The system was not designed to challenge its own fundamental assumptions without overwhelming proof that existing frameworks were wrong. The third warning arrived in January 1943 from an unexpected source. A German signals intelligence unit monitoring Allied radio traffic in the Mediterranean intercepted and decoded messages between American supply officers discussing equipment deliveries to forward units. The messages were routine logistics communications, the mundane traffic of military supply chains tracking shipments and coordinating deliveries. One intercept referenced a convoy delivering 230 M4 units to American forces in Algeria. The signals intelligence analysts flagged this as potentially significant, suggesting Americans were moving 230 tanks in a single convoy shipment. Such numbers implied substantial production capacity and sophisticated logistics networks capable of shipping hundreds of tanks across the Atlantic Ocean through submarine-infested waters and distributing them to combat units in North Africa. The intercept report was forwarded to Foreign Armies West for assessment. Major Bergmann reviewed the message text personally, noting the specific terminology and numerical details. 230 tanks in one shipment was remarkable, but it might represent accumulated production from several months, or redistribution of existing stocks, or transfers from training units to combat formations. The intercept did not definitively prove current monthly production rates, though it certainly suggested robust manufacturing and logistics capability. Bergmann added the signals intelligence to his growing file of ambiguous indicators that American tank production might exceed German estimates. The file now contained the Swedish intelligence report claiming over 1,000 tanks in the first quarter of 1942, the serial number analysis suggesting higher production volumes than predicted, and the signals intercept describing large-scale shipments. Each individual piece of evidence could be explained away or questioned, but collectively they suggested a pattern that made Bergmann increasingly uncomfortable with official estimates. He drafted a memorandum to Colonel von Roen proposing a comprehensive reassessment of American tank production based on accumulated evidence suggesting current estimates might be low. The memorandum acknowledged uncertainty, but argued that prudent intelligence analysis required updating assessments when multiple independent indicators pointed toward similar conclusions. Underestimating enemy production capacity carried greater strategic risk than overestimating it. Von Roen read the memorandum and scheduled a meeting with Bergmann to discuss the proposal in detail. The colonel was a professional intelligence officer, one of the more capable and intellectually honest senior analysts in German military intelligence. He understood that intelligence estimates required periodic revision as new information became available. But he also understood institutional politics and the challenges of revising established assessments without compelling evidence that would convince skeptical operational commanders. The meeting was scheduled for February 20th, 1943. Before that meeting occurred, the photostat from Switzerland arrived on Bergmann's desk. The Automotive Industry magazine article with its claim of 2008 medium tanks produced in November 1942 alone, 20 times the German baseline estimate for monthly American production. The number was so far outside expected ranges that it appeared to be obvious propaganda or misprint. But Bergmann had spent enough time analyzing American industrial practices to recognize that Automotive Industries was a legitimate trade publication, not a propaganda outlet. The magazine had been published since 1913, serving automotive industry professionals with technical information, production statistics, and industry news. Its circulation was primarily domestic American readers working in manufacturing, not foreign audiences who might be targets of morale-building propaganda. The article's context was a war bonds promotional campaign, encouraging Americans to buy bonds by highlighting industrial achievements. The production statistics were presented matter-of-factly, embedded in longer discussions of factory employment, shift schedules, and manufacturing innovations. This was not the tone or format of propaganda aimed at foreign consumption. This was American industry talking to itself about its accomplishments, using specific numbers that industry professionals would recognize as accurate or fraudulent based on their own knowledge. If the numbers were fabricated, American automotive industry readers would know immediately. A trade publication would not risk its credibility with its core readership by publishing obviously false production statistics. Bergmann read through the article multiple times, searching for qualifications or caveats that might explain the numbers in less alarming terms. Perhaps 2008 included all armoured vehicles, not just medium tanks. Perhaps it represented cumulative production over multiple months, rather than a single month's output. Perhaps there was ambiguity in the terminology that made the figures less concerning than they appeared at first reading. The article was explicit. 2008 M4 Sherman medium tanks produced in November 1942. Not cumulative, not including light tanks or other vehicles, not ambiguous in any way that suggested alternative interpretation. The text described this as a single month's output from American facilities producing the Shermans specifically. The article went on to note that production was expected to increase further in coming 2 months as additional facilities came online and existing plants optimized their processes. If this was accurate, even remotely accurate, German intelligence estimates were not wrong by small margins amenable to minor corrections. They were wrong by factors of 20 to 1. The entire analytical framework that had produced those estimates was fundamentally flawed, based on assumptions about industrial mobilization that simply did not apply to American industrial capacity. The implications extended far beyond tank production numbers into questions about American aircraft production, artillery production, truck production, shipbuilding. every category of military equipment where German estimates relied on similar assumptions about manufacturing timelines and capacity limitations. Bergmann placed the article in a folder, added his accumulated file of ambiguous indicators pointing toward higher American production, and walked down the corridor to Colonel von Ruen's office. He did not wait for the scheduled meeting. This could not wait. Von Ruen listened in silence as Bergmann presented the Automotive Industries article and explained his analysis of why the numbers might be credible despite appearing absurd. The colonel asked careful questions about the publication's history, typical content, readership, and reliability. He examined the photostat closely, noting publication details, article context, and specific wording. He reviewed Bergmann's file of accumulated indicators, the Swedish intelligence report, the serial number analysis, the signals intercept. He sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for several long moments. If Americans are producing 2,000 tanks per month, von Ruen said slowly, we need to know immediately. If they are not, we need to know why this publication is claiming they are. Either way, we need definitive information, not speculation, based on a single magazine article. I want a full intelligence collection effort focused on American tank production, every available source, every collection method. I want answers, within 30 days. The systematic intelligence effort that followed over the next 4 weeks represented one of the most intensive focused collection operations Foreign Armies West conducted during the entire war. Every intelligence resource available to German military intelligence was directed toward a single question: how many tanks was America actually producing? The effort began with the most direct but also most dangerous method: human intelligence collection in the United States itself. Germany maintained limited agent networks in America, primarily operating out of diplomatic facilities in Washington and New York, under cover of embassy and consulate personnel. These networks had been severely constrained after America entered the war in December 1941. German diplomats were under constant FBI surveillance, their movements restricted, their communications monitored. Recruitment of American sources had become nearly impossible given the hostile environment and vigorous American counterintelligence operations. Despite these constraints, German intelligence officers in America were instructed to collect any available information about tank production through observation, contacts with neutral country diplomats who might have better access, and careful monitoring of American media and public statements. The instructions were transmitted through coded cable traffic, carefully worded to avoid explicit references to specific intelligence requirements that might be intercepted and decoded by American signals intelligence. The response came within 2 weeks. A German military attaché in Washington reported observing a war bonds rally in Detroit, where a senior executive from Chrysler Corporation gave a speech highlighting his company's contributions to military production. The executive specifically mentioned that the Chrysler tank arsenal in Warren, Michigan, had produced over 800 Sherman tanks in January 1943 and was targeting 1,000 tanks monthly by spring. The speech was public, delivered to a crowd of thousands, covered by local newspapers. The production figures were presented as achievements to celebrate, not secrets to conceal. The attaché included newspaper clippings of the speech in his diplomatic pouch, providing contemporaneous documentation of the claims. This was a second independent source, completely separate from the Automotive Industries article, confirming tank production numbers that exceeded German estimates by extraordinary margins. If Chrysler alone was producing 800 to 1,000 tanks monthly, and Chrysler was one of multiple American companies producing Shermans, then total American production could easily reach 2,000 or more tanks per month. The estimates were not propaganda. They were accurate descriptions of American industrial output, publicly acknowledged by senior industry executives with direct knowledge of production operations. The signals intelligence effort produced complementary evidence from a different direction. German cryptographic services had achieved limited success, breaking certain categories of American military communications, particularly lower-level logistics and administrative traffic that used less sophisticated encryption methods compared to strategic communications. The signals intelligence effort was directed to focus specifically on intercepting American military logistics communications related to tank shipments and deliveries. Over a 2-week period, German signals intelligence units intercepted dozens of routine messages between American supply officers in North Africa, supply depots in Britain, and logistics commands in the United States. The messages discussed equipment allocations, shipping schedules, convoy organization, and unit requests for replacement vehicles. One particularly illuminating intercept was a weekly summary report from an American logistics command tracking equipment in the Mediterranean theater. The message listed total M4 Sherman tank inventory in theater as of February 1, 1943, 2,147 units. This included tanks with forward combat units, tanks in depot storage awaiting distribution, tanks undergoing maintenance and repair, and tanks in transit between bases. The message also noted that 342 additional Shermans had been delivered from the United States during the previous week, with similar deliveries expected to continue weekly. If the Americans were delivering over 300 tanks per week to the Mediterranean theater alone, and they were simultaneously building up forces in Britain for eventual operations in Western Europe, and they were maintaining training and homeland defense forces in the continental United States, then their total monthly production had to be extraordinary. The signals intelligence confirmed massive scale of American tank deployment that was only possible with production rates far exceeding German baseline estimates. The aerial reconnaissance effort was more limited due to the distances involved and German Air Force capability constraints. The Luftwaffe could not conduct reconnaissance missions over American industrial facilities in the continental United States. The distances were too great, the risks too high, the aerial refueling technology unavailable. But German reconnaissance aircraft could photograph British ports where American equipment arrived before distribution to combat theatres. 2 long-range reconnaissance missions were flown over British ports in late February 1943, specifically targeting facilities known to receive American equipment shipments. The missions were dangerous, flown at extreme range, vulnerable to British air defences and fighter interception. Both aircraft returned successfully, with extensive photographic coverage of port facilities along the western coast of Britain. Photo interpreters analysed the reconnaissance imagery systematically, identifying vehicles by type based on visual characteristics. American Sherman tanks were distinctive in shape and could be recognised in aerial photographs with reasonable confidence, particularly when parked in organised lots or loading areas where their profiles were clearly visible. The photo interpreters counted 237 Sherman tanks visible in the imagery from a single port facility, photographed on February 23, 1943. This represented tanks currently present at one British port on one specific day. It did not include tanks that had already been distributed to forward units, tanks stored at other ports or depot facilities, or tanks currently at sea in convoys crossing the Atlantic. The number visible in one location on one day suggested tremendous volume of equipment flowing through the logistics pipeline. German logistics officers, reviewing the reconnaissance imagery, noted that they had never seen comparable concentrations of German tanks at any single location, even major depot facilities in Germany that served as distribution centres for multiple armies. The technical intelligence assessment came from detailed examination of captured Sherman tanks conducted by specialized teams at the Kummersdorf proving grounds outside Berlin. German technical intelligence maintained elaborate facilities for testing captured enemy equipment under controlled conditions. Captured tanks were disassembled completely, every component catalogued and analyzed, metallurgy tested, manufacturing methods evaluated, design philosophy documented. A team of engineers and manufacturing specialists examined Sherman components, specifically looking for evidence of production methods and manufacturing scale. What they found was revealing and disturbing. The Sherman components showed evidence of mass production techniques rarely seen in German military manufacturing. Armor plates were cut and shaped by massive hydraulic presses that could process steel at rates far exceeding traditional manufacturing methods. Hulls were assembled using extensive welding rather than riveting, faster and requiring less skilled labor when proper jigs and fixtures were employed. The cast turrets were produced using foundry techniques that allowed rapid production once molds were created. But the most telling evidence came from the standardization of components across multiple captured vehicles. German engineers examined transmissions, engines, suspension components, and numerous other parts from Shermans manufactured by different companies at different facilities during different months. The interchangeability was nearly perfect. Components from a Sherman built by Chrysler in Michigan were mechanically identical to components from a Sherman built by Fisher Body, a division of General Motors, in Ohio. This level of standardization, this precision interchangeability across manufacturers and facilities, indicated industrial capacity and organizational sophistication that German manufacturing had never achieved at comparable scale. It meant that American industry had successfully implemented assembly line production for military vehicles at scale, normally reserved for civilian automobiles. The Germans had always assumed military vehicle production required more custom fabrication, more individual fitting and adjustment, more skilled craftsman labor compared to civilian automotive manufacturing. The Americans had apparently eliminated those traditional distinctions, applying civilian automotive production methods directly to military vehicles with minimal modification. This was only possible with extraordinary investment in tooling, fixtures, precision machinery, and worker training. But once implemented, it enabled production rates that traditional military manufacturing methods could never achieve. The technical intelligence assessment concluded that American tank production capacity was limited primarily by raw material availability and factory floor space, not by manufacturing time per vehicle or skilled labor constraints that limited German production. If Americans had sufficient steel and sufficient factory capacity, they could produce tanks as rapidly as they produced civilian automobiles in peacetime, when American automotive output reached millions of vehicles annually. Even a small fraction of that civilian automotive capacity, redirected to military production, would generate tank output measured in thousands per month, rather than hundreds. The intelligence collection effort culminated in a comprehensive assessment briefing, delivered to senior Foreign Armies West leadership on March 19, 1943. Major Bergmann presented the findings, carefully documenting each source, acknowledging uncertainties and limitations, but presenting conclusions that were difficult to dismiss given the weight of accumulated evidence from multiple independent collection methods. The Automotive Industries magazine article claiming 2008 tanks in November 1942 was corroborated by the Chrysler executive speech in Detroit, by the signals intelligence intercepts describing massive equipment shipments, by the aerial reconnaissance showing unprecedented vehicle concentrations at British ports, and by technical intelligence assessment concluding that American manufacturing methods could support such production rates. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward a single conclusion. American tank production was occurring at approximately 15 to 20 times the rate German intelligence had estimated. Current production was likely exceeding 2,000 tanks monthly and appeared to be increasing rather than decreasing as facilities expanded and production methods matured. Projected American tank production for the full year of 1943 could reach 25,000 or more medium tanks, compared to German production estimated at approximately 5,000 medium tanks for the same period. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The briefing room was silent for several long moments after Bergmann finished presenting his assessment. Colonel von Roen spoke first, asking the question that every officer in the room was considering. If Americans can produce 25,000 tanks in a year while Germany produces 5,000, how do we fight such an enemy? What strategic options remain when facing material superiority of this magnitude? The questions had no easy answers. The entire German strategic framework for fighting the war assumed rough parity in equipment production between major powers, with tactical superiority and operational Feindsstärke, skill determining outcomes. That framework collapsed when one side could produce 5 times as much equipment as the other. Numerical advantage of that magnitude overwhelmed quality differences, tactical skill, and operational expertise. No amount of superior training or better tank design could offset facing 5 enemy tanks for every German tank. The revised intelligence assessment was forwarded to higher headquarters with notation that it represented fundamental revision of previous estimates based on comprehensive multi-source collection effort. The assessment emphasized high confidence in conclusions despite their dramatic divergence from established baselines. The evidence was too consistent across too many independent sources to dismiss as anomaly or deception. The response from operational commands revealed the institutional resistance that intelligence analysts had anticipated. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the Mediterranean, received a copy of the assessment in late March 1943. His reaction was documented in a message to Wehrmacht High Command, questioning the credibility of intelligence estimates that contradicted operational experience. German forces in Tunisia were successfully engaging American armor in combat and achieving favorable exchange ratios, Kesselring noted. If Americans possessed such overwhelming numerical superiority in tank production, where were these thousands of tanks? The logic seemed compelling from a field commander's perspective. Combat results demonstrated German tactical superiority. American tanks were being destroyed at acceptable rates. German defensive positions were holding against American attacks. Nothing in the immediate tactical situation suggested the Americans possessed crushing material advantage. The intelligence assessment might be technically accurate about production numbers, Kesselring conceded, but combat effectiveness was determined by factors beyond raw production statistics. Quality of crews, tactical doctrine, operational planning, logistics support, maintenance capabilities. All these factors influenced battlefield performance. Producing 2,000 tanks monthly meant nothing if those tanks were poorly manned, inadequately maintained, or employed using ineffective tactical methods. Kesselring's response reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how material superiority manifests in sustained operations. The tactical engagements in Tunisia represented initial combat between relatively small forces operating in constrained geography. German tactical advantages were real and measurable in such contexts. But the war would not be decided by individual engagements in North Africa. It would be decided by sustained operations across multiple theaters over years of combat, where cumulative production advantages would eventually overwhelm tactical proficiency. Major Bergmann and his colleagues in Foreign Armies West prepared a detailed response, explaining why production rates of 2,000 tanks monthly would fundamentally alter the strategic balance within 12 to 18 months, even if immediate tactical situation did not yet reflect American numerical advantages. The response included mathematical projections of force ratios over time, assuming various combat loss rates and production levels. The projections demonstrated that even with favorable German kill ratios of 3 or 4 to 1, American production advantages would eventually create numerical superiority that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. If Germany produced 5,000 tanks annually, while America produced 25,000, the cumulative disparity would become insurmountable by mid-1944. German forces would face 5 American tanks for every German tank, perhaps 10 to 1 in specific theaters where Americans concentrated their forces. No historical precedent existed for successfully defending against such numerical odds in mechanized warfare between industrial powers. The mathematical reality was absolute. Production determined sustainability in attritional warfare, and America's production capacity exceeded Germany's by factors that made German defeat inevitable, absent fundamental changes in strategic circumstances. The response was forwarded through proper channels but generated limited substantive discussion at senior leadership levels. The institutional culture of the Wehrmacht, shaped by decades of emphasis on operational excellence and tactical innovation, struggled to accept that industrial production might matter more than military skill. The Prussian military tradition that had shaped German military thinking for generations emphasized quality of forces over quantity, superior training over numerical advantage, operational art over material attrition. Hitler himself embodied this bias toward willpower and tactical brilliance over material considerations. He had consistently dismissed intelligence assessments that emphasized enemy material advantages, preferring to focus on German qualitative superiority and the supposed weakness of enemy morale. When presented with intelligence about American tank production, his response was to demand increased German production, improved German tank designs, and renewed offensive operations that would demonstrate German superiority regardless of enemy numbers. The actual impact of American tank production became visible during the summer and autumn of 1943 as Allied forces invaded Sicily in July and mainland Italy in September. German commanders in Italy found themselves facing American armored units that seemed to multiply regardless of combat losses. A German tank battalion might destroy a dozen American Shermans in a successful engagement, only to face 24 more Shermans the following week, as American units were rapidly reinforced and re-equipped. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, commanding German forces in southern Italy, sent increasingly urgent reports to Berlin, describing American material superiority that exceeded anything he had encountered on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces. The Americans were not just numerous, he wrote, they were wasteful in their abundance. American units would abandon vehicles with minor mechanical problems rather than repair them, simply requisitioning replacement vehicles from apparently unlimited stocks. Damaged tanks were not always recovered and repaired. They were sometimes left in place while completely new tanks were issued to crews. Supply dumps, captured during German counterattacks, contained spare parts, replacement engines, and components in quantities that exceeded total German stocks for entire armies. Von Vietinghoff reported observing American tank companies conducting training exercises behind the front lines, using dozens of tanks for practice maneuvers, vehicles that were apparently surplus to immediate operational requirements. The German army never had surplus tanks available for training while combat operations were ongoing. Every available vehicle was committed to frontline units or held as operational reserve for emergency deployment. The disparity in material availability affected operations at every level. American commanders could afford aggressive tactics that accepted equipment losses in exchange for tactical gains because losses would be replaced immediately. German commanders had to husband limited resources, avoiding attritional engagements even when tactically favorable because losses were essentially permanent. An American tank company that lost half its vehicles in combat would be fully re-equipped within days. a German tank company suffering similar losses might wait months for replacements that would never arrive. The aerial reconnaissance missions over Britain continued throughout 1943, documenting the build-up of American forces for the eventual invasion of Western Europe. The photographic evidence was damning in its cumulative weight. Port facilities photographed in March showed hundreds of American tanks. The same facilities photographed in June showed thousands. By October 1943, photo interpreters were counting American tank parks, containing over 3,000 vehicles at multiple locations across southern England. These were tanks waiting for the invasion, accumulated stockpiles being assembled for the massive amphibious operation everyone knew was coming. The numbers visible in aerial photography represented only a fraction of total American tank production. They did not include tanks already deployed to Italy, tanks operating in the Pacific Theater against Japanese forces, tanks retained in the United States for training and homeland defense, or tanks currently being produced in American factories. The visible accumulation in Britain alone exceeded total German tank production for an entire year. German tank production in 1943 reached approximately 5,500 medium tanks, according to post-war analysis of German industrial records. This represented maximum output from German industry operating under extreme pressure, with extended work shifts, streamlined production processes, and ruthless resource allocation. Albert Speer, appointed armaments minister in February 1942, had achieved remarkable increases in German military production through rationalization of manufacturing and more efficient use of resources, including extensive employment of forced labor. The 5,500 tanks produced in 1943 was more than double the 1942 production level and represented what German industry could achieve when fully mobilized for military production. Yet this maximum effort produced fewer tanks than Americans were manufacturing in 3 months. The mathematical impossibility of competing with American industrial capacity was written clearly in production statistics that German leadership could not ignore, though they consistently underestimated the strategic implications. American production in 1943 reached 29,699 tanks, according to post-war records compiled by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. This was the actual number, documented in factory production records, delivery manifests, and unit equipment inventories. 29,699 tanks in a single year. More than 5 times German production. More than 20 times the original German intelligence estimate of American monthly capacity. The numbers represented industrial mobilization on a scale unprecedented in military history. No nation had ever produced military equipment at such rates. The Soviet Union, with its massive industrial base and total war mobilization, produced approximately 24,000 tanks in 1943. The Soviet effort was extraordinary, requiring evacuation of entire factories eastward away from German advances, reconstruction of industrial capacity under wartime conditions, and maximum exploitation of available resources and labor. Yet America, fighting a 2-front war across 2 oceans, exceeded even Soviet tank production, while simultaneously producing more aircraft than all other nations combined, building merchant ships faster than German submarines could sink them, manufacturing trucks by the hundreds of thousands, and supplying Allied forces worldwide with equipment, ammunition, and supplies. The scale of American industrial mobilization was incomprehensible to military planners trained in European industrial traditions, where production was always constrained by labor, materials, or manufacturing capacity. The German intelligence assessment of March 1943 had been accurate in its core conclusion that American tank production exceeded previous estimates by factors of 15 to 20. But even that dramatic revision had been conservative. The analysts had estimated 25,000 tanks for the full year. Actual production exceeded 29,000. The intelligence methodology had been sound, the evidence properly analyzed, the conclusions logically derived. Yet the full reality of American industrial capacity exceeded even the revised intelligence estimates. Individual German commanders began understanding the implications through direct combat experience during 1944 as Allied forces invaded Normandy and drove across France. The experiences of Panzer-Lehr Division illustrated how overwhelming material superiority manifested in operational reality. Panzer-Lehr was an elite German armoured division, formed in late 1943 by combining demonstration units and training formations into a combat division. The unit was equipped with the newest German tanks, including Panther medium tanks and Tiger heavy tanks. The personnel were experienced, many having served as instructors at tank schools before being assigned to the division. The division represented the best of German armoured capability, quality equipment operated by skilled crews employing proven tactical methods. Panzer-Lehr deployed to Normandy in June 1944 and immediately engaged Allied forces pushing inland from the invasion beaches. The division fought skillfully, conducting effective counterattacks and defensive operations. German tank crews achieved impressive kill ratios, regularly destroying multiple Allied tanks for each German vehicle lost. But the division was ground down through attritional combat that lasted weeks and then months. Every engagement resulted in irreplaceable losses of tanks and experienced crew members. By the end of July 1944, Panzer-Lehr Division had been reduced to approximately 40 operational tanks from its initial strength of approximately 183 tanks and assault guns. The division had inflicted disproportionate losses on Allied forces, but had been destroyed as an effective fighting formation through sustained combat against enemies who could absorb losses and continue operations without pause. The division was withdrawn from combat, officially for rest and refit, but it would never be restored to full strength because Germany lacked the production capacity to replace equipment losses and lacked the time to train replacement crews to the division's previous high standards. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer-Lehr, was a highly experienced officer who had served as Chief of Staff to Erwin Rommel in North Africa and understood armoured warfare as well as any German officer. In post-war interviews, Bayerlein described the experience of fighting in Normandy as being overwhelmed by materiel rather than defeated by tactical superiority. The Allies, he said, were not better soldiers or better tacticians. Their equipment was not superior to German vehicles and weapons, but they had so much of everything, so many tanks, so much artillery, so many aircraft, so much ammunition, that German tactical advantages became meaningless. His tanks would destroy 5 Allied tanks and then be destroyed by the 6th or 7th or 10th. His positions would repel attack after attack and then be overrun when Allied forces brought up additional units that German forces could not match. The entire campaign was decided by arithmetic, Bayerlein concluded. Germany simply could not kill Allied tanks and soldiers faster than they could be replaced, while every German loss diminished already inadequate forces. The mathematics made defeat inevitable regardless of tactical performance. Similar experiences were reported by German commanders across all theatres during 1944 and 1945. On the Eastern Front, where German forces faced Soviet numerical superiority that had always exceeded German strength, the addition of thousands of American Lend-Lease tanks to Soviet forces made an already difficult situation catastrophic. The Soviet Union received 4,102 M4 Sherman medium tanks and 7,056 other American tanks through Lend-Lease programs during the war. These American-supplied tanks supplemented massive Soviet domestic production, creating armoured forces that overwhelmed German defences through pure mass. In Italy, German forces conducted skillful defensive operations that slowed Allied advances but could never stop them permanently, because Allied material advantages allowed sustained offensive operations regardless of tactical setbacks. In Western Europe after the Normandy invasion, German forces fought with courage and professional competence, but were steadily pushed back by Allied offensives that simply overwhelmed defensive positions through concentration of force that Germany could not match or counter. Every theatre told the same story of German tactical proficiency rendered strategically irrelevant by crushing Allied material superiority. The personal trajectory of Major Klaus Bergmann, the intelligence officer who first identified the magnitude of German miscalculation about American tank production, illustrated the institutional failure to act on accurate intelligence. Bergmann continued serving in Foreign Armies West throughout 1944, watching his analysis from March 1943 being validated month after month by combat reports from all theatres. His initial assessment that American production exceeded German estimates by factors of 15 to 20 was proven conservative as actual American output became visible through operational deployments. He was not promoted, despite the accuracy of his intelligence work. He was not recognized for having identified a fundamental error in German strategic calculations early enough that some adjustments might have been possible. Instead, he continued, performing routine intelligence analysis in an organization that had documented the mathematical impossibility of German victory, but could not persuade leadership to act on that knowledge. Bergmann survived the war, surrendered to American forces in May 1945, and was interviewed by American intelligence officers seeking to understand German intelligence capabilities and failures. In those interviews, conducted in June 1945, Bergmann was remarkably candid about the institutional failures that had prevented German intelligence from influencing strategic decisions. German intelligence services had accurately identified American industrial capacity by early 1943, he explained. The analysis had been systematic, based on multiple independent sources, rigorously checked against available evidence. The conclusions had been properly documented and forwarded to senior leadership with appropriate emphasis on strategic implications. But the institutional culture of German military leadership could not accept intelligence that contradicted fundamental assumptions about warfare. The idea that production mattered more than tactical skill, that industrial capacity determined outcomes more than operational excellence, that quantity could overwhelm quality given sufficient numerical advantage, these concepts violated everything German military tradition valued and emphasized. Intelligence that supported comfortable assumptions was accepted and acted upon. Intelligence that challenged core beliefs was acknowledged, but not truly integrated into operational planning or strategic decision-making. The result was a war fought based on assumptions that were demonstrably wrong by early 1943, assumptions that intelligence services had identified as wrong, assumptions that continued guiding strategic decisions for another 2 years, while Germany was systematically destroyed. Bergmann's account provided insight into how military organizations fail, not through lack of information, but through inability to accept information that contradicts institutional preferences and cultural biases. The final accounting was written in production statistics that told the story more clearly than any after-action report or operational analysis. Germany produced approximately 27,000 medium and heavy tanks during the entire war, from 1939 through 1945. This represented maximum output from German industry, plus captured factories in occupied territories, utilizing forced labor on massive scale, operating under ruthless resource allocation and accepting deteriorating quality standards as the war progressed. 27,000 tanks over 6 years of total war and maximum industrial mobilization, the United States produced approximately 49,000 234 Sherman medium tanks alone during the period from 1942 through 1945. This did not include the 6,258 M3 medium tanks produced earlier, nor the thousands of light tanks, tank destroyers, and other armoured vehicles manufactured simultaneously. Shermans alone, from a single tank model, exceeded total German medium and heavy tank production for the entire war by a factor of nearly 2 to 1. And Sherman production was just one category of American armoured vehicle manufacturing. Total American production of all armoured fighting vehicles during the war exceeded 88,000 units. American tank production peaked in 1943 at 29,699 tanks, then declined slightly in 1944 and 1945, not because of production constraints, but because military planners determined that sufficient inventory existed and production capacity could be redirected to other priorities. America stopped producing tanks at maximum rates because they had enough, not because they reached production limits. Germany never had enough tanks, never achieved production levels adequate to meet operational requirements, and never possessed the industrial capacity to match Allied production regardless of organizational improvements or efficiency gains. The production disparity was not marginal or subject to interpretation. It was overwhelming, mathematically decisive, and apparent to careful analysis by early 1943, more than 2 years before Germany's final defeat. The intelligence failure that led Major Bergmann to his desk on February 18th, 1943, was not a failure to collect information. German intelligence had access to most of the data they needed through agent reports, signals, intercepts, technical analysis, and open-source collection. The failure was analytical and cultural, an inability to conceive that an enemy might operate under fundamentally different constraints and capabilities than German experience suggested were universal limits of industrial mobilization. German analysts projected their own limitations onto American industry and assumed American tank production would follow patterns similar to German production. They calculated American capacity based on German manufacturing methods and German organizational practices. They estimated American mobilization timelines based on German experiences with industrial expansion. Every assumption was wrong because American industry operated at scales and with methods that had no equivalent in German experience. The lesson from this historical episode extends beyond World War II and remains relevant for understanding intelligence failures in any context. The most dangerous intelligence errors are not failures to collect information, but failures to properly interpret information because of unexamined assumptions and cultural biases. German intelligence officers were educated, experienced professionals who worked diligently to assess American capabilities, but they could not see what their conceptual frameworks did not prepare them to recognize. They looked at American industry through German lenses and saw limitations that did not exist. The Automotive Industries magazine article that landed on Major Bergmann's desk in February 1943 was not intelligence in the traditional sense. It was publicly available information, printed in a commercial trade publication, accessible to anyone who could obtain an American magazine. The Germans did not need sophisticated espionage to learn about American tank production. They needed to believe what Americans were publicly stating about their own industrial achievements. The production statistics were there, published openly, because Americans saw no reason to conceal them. The numbers seemed unremarkable to American industry professionals who understood their own capabilities and production methods. Only to foreign observers operating under different assumptions did the numbers seem impossible. The intelligence failure was ultimately a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive that warfare had changed from a contest of tactical skill and operational art to a mathematical exercise in industrial output and resource mobilization. Wars between modern industrial powers are decided in factories before outcomes are determined on battlefields. This principle, proven definitively in World War II, was visible to German intelligence analysts by early 1943. They documented it carefully, presented it accurately, and watched helplessly as their analysis was acknowledged but not acted upon. The war continued for 2 more years after German intelligence confirmed that victory was mathematically impossible. Millions died in fighting that careful analysis had shown could not change the ultimate outcome. Cities were destroyed, populations devastated, Europe reduced to rubble, all while intelligence reports documented the arithmetic of inevitable defeat. Major Klaus Bergmann understood this by February 1943. He knew Germany could not win. He knew American production would eventually overwhelm German forces regardless of tactical performance. He knew the mathematics made defeat certain. And he knew that his knowledge would change nothing because the system was not designed to accept uncomfortable truths that undermined the entire basis for continuing the war. Intelligence serves no purpose if leadership will not act on accurate assessment. German intelligence provided accurate warning of American industrial capacity. German leadership chose to ignore that warning and fight on based on faith in tactical superiority and willpower overcoming material disadvantage. The result was Germany's complete destruction and unconditional surrender in May 1945, defeated not by any single battle or campaign, but by the cumulative weight of Allied material superiority that German intelligence had, documented 2 years earlier. The captured Automotive Industries magazine article remained in the files of Foreign Armies West until the organization was dissolved following German surrender. American intelligence officers discovered the document during post-war examination of captured German intelligence archives. They noted with interest that Germans had obtained accurate information about American tank production in early 1943 and had documented the strategic implications in detailed intelligence assessments. The Americans were impressed by the thoroughness of German intelligence collection and analysis. They were baffled by the failure to act on accurate intelligence once obtained. The tragedy was not that Germany lacked information about American capabilities. The tragedy was that accurate information made no difference to strategic decisions because institutional culture could not accept implications that contradicted fundamental beliefs about warfare. Germans expected 100 Shermans per month, based on their own industrial experience and assumptions about mobilization constraints. America built 2,000 per month by applying civilian automotive production methods to military manufacturing at scale German industry had never attempted. When German intelligence discovered the truth, they documented it carefully and presented it clearly, and then watched as the machinery of war continued operating based on assumptions everyone knew were wrong, because stopping would have required admitting that the war had been lost before it truly began. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.